"You towed what?" I yelled, trying to process the horror unfolding on my front lawn. A Civil War-era Union supply wagon, a literal piece of American history, was gone. All that remained were scuffed tire marks and a severed security chain, flailing in the wind like a forgotten relic itself. My throat dried as I blinked, hoping this was a joke, a prank, maybe a movie set? Nope. The 6-foot historical marker I'd placed beside the wagon, the brass plaque detailing its 1863 origin, even the laminated "Do Not Move" registered historic artifact sign all ignored. And I knew exactly who was behind it. Karen. HOA president, suburban dictator, and destroyer of anything that dared challenge her rule of sterile uniformity. She had finally crossed the line. She hadn't just messed with my property, she had declared war on American history itself. Let me rewind 24 hours. I live in a designated historical district just outside Richmond, Virginia. My house was built in 1871 and has a white wraparound porch that practically begs for sweet tea and ghost stories. When I moved in, I made it a mission to honor the history of the place. That's how I ended up bidding on and winning a genuine Civil War wagon from a preservation auction. It had belonged to the Union Army's 2nd Supply Regiment and had been restored by a team of war historians. I mean, it still smelled like pine tar and old gunpowder. I parked it proudly in my own driveway. My private property, mind you, with all the legal documentation in a neat folder inside my home office, just in case anyone had questions. But of course, Karen didn't ask questions. Karen never asks questions. She assumes. She commands. She patrols the neighborhood in her pastel-colored tracksuits, clutching a clipboard like a law enforcement badge. The woman once issued a citation to a neighbor for having a Halloween skeleton up past November 2nd. She scowls at any car not washed in the past 3 days and believes every flowerbed should contain precisely 3 species of HOA-approved vegetation. So when she first saw my wagon, I could already feel the HOA rage storm forming in her soul. "You can't just park junk in the driveway," she said that afternoon, strutting over like a pigeon in heat. I explained, calmly and thoroughly, that the wagon wasn't junk. It was a registered artifact and protected by both County Historical Code and the Virginia Historical Preservation Committee. She smirked like she hadn't heard a word. "It's an eyesore. The HOA has standards." I reminded her that my property was technically not under HOA jurisdiction, a fun fact I'd researched thoroughly before buying. She didn't like that. Her eye twitched. I could practically see the gears in her head grinding to find a way to assert control. She turned on her heel and said nothing else. That's when I should have known something shady was coming. That night, I noticed a strange car slow roll past my house 3 times. Around 2 a.m., my motion sensor camera caught a figure. Short, stocky, definitely Karen-shaped, taking pictures of the wagon. I wasn't worried though. I had the law on my side and the receipts to prove it. Plus, who in their right mind would tow a literal museum piece? Apparently Karen, that's who. When I discovered the wagon missing the next day, I went into full detective mode. First stop, security footage. Sure enough, the tow truck arrived around 7:20 a.m., while I was out grabbing groceries. Karen was standing right next to the driver, flailing her arms like she was directing a space shuttle landing. She handed the guy a form, some forged authorization no doubt, and watched proudly as the wagon was hoisted onto the truck like it was an abandoned mattress. I was stunned. Who does that? Who looks at a historic wagon with wooden spokes older than their own family tree and thinks, "Yeah, let's junk it?" I called the cops immediately. They were sympathetic, but hesitant. Technically, this was a civil matter unless I could prove theft or impersonation. I showed them the footage. That helped. Then I drove straight to every towing yard within 20 miles until I found the poor wagon, dumped behind a shed like unwanted garbage. One wheel was cracked. Paint had been scraped off one side. A family of raccoons had started nesting inside it. I nearly cried. I had spent $40,000. Yes, $40,000, restoring that piece of history. Not to flip, not for clout, but because I believed in honoring the stories that built this country. When I returned, towing my own wagon back with the help of a friend and a flatbed trailer, I saw Karen standing on her porch sipping coffee like nothing had happened. I marched straight up and demanded an explanation. I had it towed, she said with a shrug. It was bringing down property values. I told her it was worth more than her entire house. I didn't know it was real, she scoffed, then added, you shouldn't leave junk out where people can mistake it. Mistake it? Mistake it? It had a metal plaque. It had an engraved sign from the Virginia Historical Preservation Committee. And it was parked on my own driveway. That's when I saw red. But I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I smiled. Because I knew something she didn't know. I had her on video. I had the document. I had the law. And most importantly, I had a plan. Karen had overstepped big time. And if she thought toying with my property was going to be a slap-on-the-wrist affair, she was in for a shock bigger than Sherman's March. This wasn't just about a wagon anymore. This was about power, arrogance, and justice, and the war had only just begun. The sun was high and mocking as I stood in the gravel lot of a junkyard 2 towns over, staring at the battered remains of my historic treasure. My beloved Civil War supply wagon sat like a wounded soldier, one wheel cracked, its side panel gouged from being scraped against metal fencing, and the once proud star-emblazoned canvas now ripped in 2 places. It was like someone had taken a relic from the Smithsonian and dragged it through a demolition derby. The guy at the yard, a burly man named Pete who smelled like axle grease and despair, looked more confused than apologetic. She said it was an abandoned movie prop, he muttered, scratching his beard. Signed off on it and everything. Looked official. I showed him the video footage on my phone. The moment Karen handed that authorization to the tow driver like she was Napoleon claiming victory. Pete squinted and said, "Yeah, that's her." Didn't say nothing about it being an antique. He gave me a small discount on the release fee, which was something, but no amount of lowered cost could fix the damage Karen had just caused, to history, to principle, to my damn blood pressure. I hauled the wagon back home, careful not to jostle it too much in its already fragile state. As I backed it into the driveway, neighbors started to emerge. Curious glances, furrowed brows, one even asked if I'd bought a new one, thinking it was a replica. When I told them what happened, jaws dropped. One neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, a retired schoolteacher and Civil War buff, actually gasped. "She towed it? Like just had it taken?" he asked, his voice cracking. "That thing is older than the state fair." Word spread fast. By sunset, everyone in the neighborhood knew what Karen had done. Some were horrified. A few quietly delighted in the scandal. But Karen? She doubled down. When I walked over to her house with my phone in hand and the repair estimate in the other, she opened the door with an exaggerated sigh, like I'd just interrupted her spa day. "I already told you I thought it was junk," she said, arms crossed. "Besides, it's not like it's the Mona Lisa. It's a Civil War artifact, Karen," I said slowly, enunciating every syllable like I was teaching a toddler what hot stove meant. "That wagon is worth 40 grand. It's protected under historical law. You forged authority you didn't have. That's not just an oops. That's illegal." She blinked at me, clearly not grasping the severity of her actions. Or maybe she did and just didn't care. Either way, her expression never changed. "You should be thanking me for removing an eyesore. Maybe now your house won't look like a battlefield." "Oh, don't worry," I said with a smile that could cut glass. "It's going to be a battlefield now. You just declared war and I came with receipts." I walked away before she could respond. No point wasting air on someone who thought HOA rules were superior to the Constitution. I went straight to my lawyer the next morning, bringing the footage, the repair bill, and the Historical Society's paperwork. He whistled low when he saw the appraisal value. "She's in deep," he said. "This isn't just property damage. This is impersonation, unauthorized removal, destruction of a protected artifact. We're talking criminal and civil. You could take the HOA down with her if they backed her up. That got my gears turning. See, Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor with a clipboard fetish, she was the self-crowned queen of the HOA. Her reign of terror had been going unchecked for years, fining people for leaving trash bins out an extra hour, demanding repainting of mailboxes that were faded by her standards, shaming teens for having offensive bumper stickers. No one stood up to her because she was relentless, litigious, and had wormed her way into every inch of the neighborhood's decision-making. But this time, she messed with the wrong artifact. I took my complaint to the HOA board, even though I knew they were Karen's loyal foot soldiers. The meeting was held at the community clubhouse, and I arrived with a rolling cart containing binders, exhibits, printed screenshots, and a copy of the Virginia Historic Property Statute highlighted in neon yellow. They tried to shut me down early. "This is a civil matter," said Greg, the HOA treasurer, who looked like he ironed his khakis with a ruler. "Not something the board." "She forged her authority as an HOA representative," I interrupted, "and used it to tow my property under false pretenses. That's impersonation. And unless the board formally distances itself from her actions, it becomes liable. That means all of you." Silence. I laid the papers out on the table like a poker hand, each one heavier than the last. Appraisal, $40,000. Damage estimate, $14,600. Police report number. Letter from the Virginia Historical Committee calling the incident deeply troubling. And finally the footage. Karen, handing the paper, watching the tow truck drag history away. Karen, who was in the room and had been sitting with a smug smirk up to that point, finally spoke up. "You're blowing this out of proportion. It's not like I stole the Liberty Bell." "No," I said calmly. "You stole something rarer. There are fewer than 10 of these wagons still intact in the entire country. And now mine is damaged because of your arrogance." The room was quiet again. Even Greg looked uneasy. Karen opened her mouth again, but I wasn't interested in more excuses. I gathered my materials, turned to the board, and said, "You have 48 hours to issue a public apology and disavow Karen's actions. Otherwise, I'll pursue legal action against the HOA as a whole for enabling her." Then I left. No grandstanding. Just facts and fire. Back at home, I started hearing whispers. Neighbors began talking. People who once cowered under Karen's HOA tyranny were now openly questioning her. The elderly couple down the street put up a lawn flamingo just to see if she'd dare say anything. One family hosted an impromptu front yard barbecue with music that wasn't in approved decibel levels. And Karen? She was fuming. I saw her pacing her porch, muttering to herself, still convinced she was right. But I wasn't done. No, not by a long shot. Karen thought she could erase history. I was going to make her the star of a new one. One where the HOA finally lost its iron grip, and every neighbor got their voice back. The war had started with a wagon, but I was about to bring out the heavy artillery. And this time, the whole neighborhood would be watching. I didn't sleep much that night. My brain was buzzing like a hornet's nest kicked by a barefoot hiker. Karen had pushed too far, and while I could have just let the lawyers handle it quietly, that felt like giving her a silent win. No, I wanted something louder. Something that would echo down the halls of HOA history with the same drama as the Gettysburg Address. That's when the idea struck me. If she wanted to treat the neighborhood like a battlefield of control, then I'd give her a full-on Civil War reenactment on her doorstep. The next morning, I reached out to a friend of mine, Curtis, who just so happened to be a member of the local Civil War Reenactment Society. The man owned more blue wool than a Navy surplus store and had once spent an entire weekend living in a tent with hardtack and zero Wi-Fi for the sake of historical accuracy. When I explained what Karen had done, he gasped like I'd told him someone had spray-painted over Lincoln's face on Mount Rushmore. "She did what to your wagon?" he shouted through the phone, followed immediately by the sound of boots clomping as he gathered the troops, literally. By noon, we had plans to host a full-scale Civil War History Day right in the neighborhood. Educational, family-friendly, and fully legal since my property wasn't under HOA control. And just for fun, we scheduled it for the same weekend Karen had planned her annual Garden of the Year neighborhood walkthrough. Nothing like historically accurate cannon fire to drown out some hydrangea judging. Curtis spread the word like a general rallying his army. Within 48 hours, I had commitments from 3 infantry units, 1 cavalry team with real horses, a mobile blacksmith, and a cannon team. Yes, a cannon team. We were going big. I even got a call from the local news who caught wind of the story after a viral social media post showing Karen's outburst at the HOA meeting. Suddenly, my little act of rebellion had turned into a full-on community spectacle. The day of the event arrived with the kind of crisp air that makes you feel like something epic is about to happen. Tents were pitched in my yard, blue coats marched up and down the street, and my freshly restored wagon gleamed in the sunlight with its new paint job and polished brass. A velvet rope protected it, and right in front stood a tall plaque that read, "Civil War Supply Wagon, Survived Antietam, Gettysburg and Karen." The reenactment began with a bang, literally. A cannon blast startled a few birds and possibly Karen's cat, but the kids watching loved it. Parents brought lawn chairs. Neighbors brought potluck dishes. Someone set up a lemonade stand and started selling freedom juice for charity. It was everything the HOA had tried to crush, joyful, unsanctioned, and wildly unapproved. Karen emerged from her house wearing a pink visor and an expression that could curdle milk. She stomped down the driveway like she was storming the beaches of Normandy instead of facing off with men in wool uniforms. "What is all this?" she demanded, gesturing to the gathering crowd. I greeted her with my friendliest tone. "It's Civil War History Day, Karen. Educational event. Open to the public. Completely legal," I checked with the city. She narrowed her eyes at me, then at the reenactors, then at the massive banner across my garage that read, "Honoring the past, protecting the future from HOA tyranny. You can't host events like this. This is a quiet neighborhood." "You mean like when you quietly stole a historic wagon?" I asked with a smile. Several nearby neighbors chuckled. Karen's jaw twitched. A local reporter with a giant microphone approached us. "Ma'am, are you the HOA president? We heard you authorized the towing of a Civil War artifact worth $40,000. Care to comment?" Karen sputtered. "I didn't know it was real. It looked like junk. Do you typically tow property off driveways that you don't own?" I was trying to improve the community. The camera kept rolling. People started recording with their phones. Karen's meltdown was happening in 4K, and there was no going back. One of the reenactors stepped up and shouted in his best dramatic voice, "This woman stands accused of crimes against history." It was a mock trial, of course, all in good fun. Or at least that's what we told the police when they arrived. Karen had called them in a desperate attempt to shut us down, but once they saw the permits, the event plans, and the very polite, fully costumed soldiers offering free biscuits, the officers shrugged. "Everything looks fine here," one of them said, clearly enjoying the absurdity of the moment. "Nice touch with the wagon, by the way." Karen stormed back into her house, but the damage had been done. Kids began chanting, "Save the wagon." Someone printed t-shirts by the end of the day. The video of her tantrum went viral within hours, racking up over 500,000 views by the next morning. People across the country weighed in, calling her General Karen and the HOA Hammer. Memes exploded across Reddit. One showed her face photoshopped onto a British redcoat with the caption, "The enemy of freedom rides again." The best part? The local historical society awarded me a certificate for outstanding contribution to public historical awareness. They even asked if they could make the Civil War History Day an annual thing. "Only if Karen is the guest of dishonor," I joked. By the time the sun dipped low and the reenactors packed up their gear, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter. Happier. United, even. People were chatting on sidewalks, laughing, sharing stories, and no one was looking over their shoulder for a violation notice. I realized something important that day. It was never just about the wagon. It was about the right to exist without being micromanaged by a self-appointed tyrant. As night fell and the last horse trotted off into the distance, I stood in front of my wagon, now secured under motion lights and a small velvet rope. I could see Karen glaring from her window, her curtain twitching like a nervous tick. And I smiled. Because the battle might have started with a tow truck, but the war was far from over. Now the whole community was awake, and Karen? She was no longer a ruler. She was a punchline. And I wasn't done yet. The quiet after the reenactment weekend was almost unnerving. No cannon blasts, no mock battle cries, no Karen yelling about the sanctity of her gardenias. Just the low hum of a shaken neighborhood finally catching its breath. But beneath that calm, a storm was brewing, only this time it was legal. I had every document, every video, every expert testimony I needed. The wagon wasn't just a damaged antique anymore. It was a $40,000 ticking time bomb under the HOA's feet, and Karen had lit the fuse with her manicured finger. The first order of business was completing the official damage report. The historical wagon restoration team, the same folks who had carefully brought the relic back to life in the first place, came out to assess the new injuries Karen's stunt had caused. They poked, measured, photographed, and sighed repeatedly. One of them, a soft-spoken man named Walter with wire-framed glasses and a beard like a Civil War general himself, turned to me with a grave nod. Whoever towed this didn't just damage wood and metal. They set preservation back years. This wheel was reconstructed using 19th-century method. It can't just be ordered off a shelf. The repair estimate came in at a painful $14,625. And that didn't even include the devaluation of the wagon's historical authenticity due to structural compromise. According to the report, the artifact's value had now dipped to about $32,000, meaning Karen had cost me nearly $8,000 in lost value, on top of everything else. Armed with that, I marched right back to my lawyer. He practically rubbed his hands together when he saw the report. "This," he said, tapping the pages, "is better than a confession. You've got clear damage, clear video evidence, and a mountain of legal leverage. We're going in." Karen, in her infinite arrogance, still hadn't realized the walls were closing in. She probably thought her tantrum during the reenactment had been a temporary embarrassment, something the internet would forget in a week. But what she didn't understand was that the HOA, once her protective shell, was now cracking under pressure. Several board members had started avoiding her. Greg, the treasurer, had sent me an email, anonymous but obvious, saying, "Some of us never agreed with her decision. Please don't punish the whole board for one person's actions." Which was hilarious, considering how vocal he had been at the last meeting defending her. We filed the lawsuit 2 days later. Civil suit for property damage, impersonation, and emotional distress. That last one was a little spicy, but according to my lawyer, the video of me discovering the wagon gone and reacting with sheer disbelief helped our case. He said juries love righteous indignation when paired with documented damages. It didn't take long for the letter to land on Karen's doorstep, and I can only imagine her expression when she read it. If her past reactions were any indication, she probably threw it into a potted plant, screamed into a pillow, and plotted revenge via passive-aggressive yard flags. But the lawsuit wasn't the only bombshell. The Virginia Historical Preservation Committee had launched their own investigation. Apparently, once the local news covered the incident and the footage went viral, they couldn't ignore it. They sent a formal inquiry to the HOA, demanding clarification about Karen's authority and the nature of the tow. Within a week, the committee had issued a public statement condemning the act and warning that individuals tampering with protected artifacts could face state-level consequences. Then came the insurance trouble. Karen, in her usual smug style, had assumed her homeowner's insurance or even the HOA's umbrella policy would protect her. But when the insurer found out she acted outside her legal authority, falsifying her role as a property manager and initiating a tow on land not under HOA jurisdiction, they denied her claim. Flat out denied. No coverage for the legal fees. No reimbursement for potential damages. Nothing. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just facing a social nightmare, she was looking at a financial one, too. That was when the cracks truly began to show. At the next emergency HOA meeting, held in a tense, overly air-conditioned community center, the board finally snapped. Members who had previously nodded along with Karen's every command were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at her like she was a lit firework no one wanted to touch. One brave soul, Patricia from the architectural committee, who had once gotten fined by Karen for having an unapproved mailbox color, stood up and said what everyone else had been thinking. "We can't keep protecting her. This is bigger than a garden dispute. She impersonated an official, destroyed someone's property, and now the entire board is being dragged into it." Karen, sitting 2 seats over in a salmon-colored blazer, hissed, "I did what I thought was right for the community." "You acted alone," Patricia shot back. "And now the community is paying the price." The vote to remove Karen as HOA president passed 5-1. The one vote in her favor was her own. She stormed out mid-meeting, muttering about lawsuits and betrayal, but no one followed her. In fact, someone clapped when the door closed behind her. A slow, sarcastic clap that turned into applause. I couldn't help but smirk. With Karen dethroned, the neighborhood exhaled. The new interim president, a level-headed guy named Alan who wore Hawaiian shirts and believed in personal freedom and barbecue, called me personally the next day. "I'm sorry for everything," he said. "This whole HOA has been walking on eggshells for years. It took a civil war to finally get rid of our own tyrant." The next twist came a week later when Karen, clearly panicked by the financial weight of the lawsuit, offered me a private settlement. She showed up unannounced, standing on my front porch with a manila envelope and an expression that screamed, "I haven't slept in days." "This could make it all go away," she said, holding it out like it was a peace offering instead of a desperation move. I didn't take it. I didn't even open it. I simply said, "You didn't care about what you destroyed. You only care that it backfired." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again and walked off in silence. We went to court the following month. It wasn't dramatic. No crying, no shouting, no last-minute surprises. Just cold hard facts. My lawyer presented the footage. The restoration team explained the damage. The preservation committee submitted a letter. And the judge, a stern woman who looked like she'd seen her fair share of HOA horror stories, ruled decisively in my favor. Karen was ordered to pay $50,000 in damages. The courtroom was silent when the verdict dropped, except for the sound of Karen's gasp. But the best part came afterward, in the parking lot, when I saw her car with a big yellow boot clamped onto the tire, courtesy of unpaid HOA fines and court fees stacking up. She sat behind the wheel, motionless, defeated. And I just walked by, tipped my invisible hat, and said, "History always finds a way to repeat itself." The months that followed felt like waking up from a long, absurd dream, only to realize that somehow the dream had left behind tangible, hilarious, and oddly satisfying result. My wagon, freshly restored once more with the full payout from Karen's court-ordered damages, now rested in a brand-new glass enclosure built right off my driveway. It stood like a small museum exhibit, complete with nighttime spotlights and a new brass plaque that read, "Civil War Supply Wagon. Survivor of Antietam, Gettysburg and HOA Karen." People slowed down to look at it. Tourists from nearby towns took photos. Someone even added it to a Google Maps location labeled Karen's Historic Mistake. What started as a nightmare became an icon. Local school groups came by for field trip. The History Society printed pamphlets with its story. And my neighborhood? It changed too. Without Karen's iron grip, People started coming out of their homes like survivors of a long, gray winter. Lawns got a little more creative. Kids played in sprinklers again. No one was worried about receiving a citation for having a flamingo lawn ornament or planting roses that weren't on the approved botanical list. The place felt alive again, finally. Alan, now officially elected as HOA president after the interim period, kept his campaign promises, mainly to scale back the rulebook and create a sense of community instead of compliance. One of his first official acts was creating an HOA advisory council, a small group that could review disputes and policy changes. To my surprise, or maybe just for irony's sake, the neighborhood voted me in as one of the members. I didn't want the job at first, but there was something poetic about it. After all the grief Karen had caused, it felt right to help steer the ship away from petty tyranny. We rewrote half the bylaws within 3 months. Out went the strict lawn guidelines, the mailbox dimensions, and the absurd seasonal decoration limit. We even passed a new rule exempting historical properties from most visual compliance code, which meant my wagon, in all its weathered, battle-worn glory, could rest peacefully without fear of another rogue tow truck showing up. One day, while adjusting the lighting on the enclosure, I noticed a woman standing on the sidewalk staring at the plaque. She looked to be in her 70s, with silver hair tucked under a wide-brimmed hat and a notebook clutched in her hand. She noticed me and smiled. "I read about this wagon in the preservation newsletter," she said. "I had to see it in person." We talked for a while. Her name was Margaret, and she worked with a Civil War museum 2 hours away. She asked questions about the wagon's restoration process, the history behind it, and, of course, the infamous HOA incident. I told her the whole saga, and by the end, she was laughing so hard she had to wipe her eyes. "Would you ever consider selling it?" she asked, only half joking. "We'd love to put it in our central exhibit." I paused. That question had come up more than once since the incident. After all, the wagon was insured and now had even more historical relevance thanks to the madness it survived. Offers had come in from collectors and curators alike, some climbing north of $75,000. But every time someone asked, my answer remained the same. "No," I said, smiling. "This one stays home." She nodded, as if she already knew. Some things weren't just artifacts. Some things carried stories too wild, too hilarious, too deeply personal to be behind museum glass. The wagon wasn't just a relic anymore. It was a monument to standing your ground against insanity, a time capsule of everything that had gone wrong and so satisfyingly right. Karen, for her part, became a recluse. After the lawsuit, the viral videos, the memes, and the full-on public collapse of her mini-empire, she all but vanished. Her house went quiet. The blinds stayed closed. Occasionally, someone would spot her at the grocery store wearing a large sun hat and sunglasses like she was avoiding paparazzi. The community moved on, but her legacy lingered, not in reverence, but in lawn signs and sarcastic holiday decorations. Someone even started a local newsletter parody called The Karen Chronicle, complete with fake HOA infractions like unauthorized lemonade stand rebellion and excessive neighbor friendliness. It was glorious. Life had a strange way of delivering justice. What began as one woman's obsession with control ended with her losing every ounce of it, all because she couldn't mind her own business. She had tried to erase a wagon from sight. Instead, she made it unforgettable. As spring rolled into summer, we hosted the second annual Civil War History Day. Bigger, better, and now sponsored by the Historical Society and a local barbecue joint. People brought their friends. The local news showed up again. Kids ran around in plastic Union hat. Even Alan, now in full reenactor garb, joined the mock tribunal and declared, "We sentence HOA tyranny to life in exile." The crowd roared. Near the end of the event, as I stood next to the wagon watching a group of teenagers take selfies in front of it, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: pride. Not just for the wagon or the spectacle, but for the community we'd managed to rebuild out of the rubble of power trips and pettiness. People talked to each other again. Laughed. Connected. The kind of place I dreamed of when I first bought the house. I glanced over at the driveway, where the wagon stood in its protected case, bathed in soft light and framed by new rose bushes. I thought about all the nights I'd spent worried, angry, trying to fix what had been broken. But as I watched families enjoying the scene, neighbors trading stories, and kids tossing water balloons in the background, I realized something else. Karen may have towed a wagon, but I towed a neighborhood back to life. And in the end, the story wasn't just about a $40,000 piece of history. It was about pushing back against ridiculous authority, about refusing to let pettiness win, and about turning one of the worst days into a legacy everyone could laugh about. Some people protect history by preserving it in glass. Others make history by refusing to let it be erased. I just happened to do both. And Karen? Well, she became part of it too. Not in the way she would have wanted, but in the only way that truly made sense. Her legacy was sealed not in policy or power, but in memes, mock trials, and the sarcastic cheers of a neighborhood finally freed from her grip. History had judged her. And the verdict was hilarious.